Today we'll wrap up Heroic. Next weekend we're going to begin a series called Blessings. And I think we're going to take it a slightly different direction than what you might expect to hear end of October, beginning of November about blessings. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that God's blessings come into our life and then flow through our lives. And what a blessing it is to be a part of that. And I think you're going to enjoy that series as we celebrate that together. It'll take us all the way into the Thanksgiving season. But as we wrap up Heroic, as you know, we've been talking from Hebrews chapter 11. And in Hebrews chapter 11, we've been taking these various examples of all these things that happen in these great men and women of the faith who are not superheroes. They're made of the same stuff that we are, but God used them because they were faithful to God at these key moments in their lives. And here's the thing. Every story that we have told you, by the time we got to the end of the sermon, going out the door, we could look at someone and say, hey, that worked out. For example, we talked about Noah, that Noah had a righteous faith. And as a result of that, when it was all said and done, though the world was lost, Noah and his family were brought through. And so you get to the end of the story, you can say, hey, that worked out. Say it with me. Hey, that worked out, right? And so we talked about his righteous faith. The next week, we talked about Rahab. You might remember that story. And her risky faith, that she put her full confidence in a God that she hardly yet knew. But she took a leap of faith and took this risk for God. And in the end, even though her city was destroyed, she was brought out, became a part of the people of God, became David's great-great-grandmother. And so at the end, you could say, hey, that worked out. Say it with me. Hey, that worked out, right? And so then last week, we talked about Isaac. We said Isaac had a resilient faith because even though they stopped up his wells, even though they took his wells, even though they really kind of forced him to move into a whole different area, all the things that he went through, before it was all said and done, he finally got the water he needed. The blessing from God came. Remember at the end of the story, God comes to him and says, Isaac, I got you covered. I'm going to bless you for generations and generations to come. And it causes us to say what? Hey, that worked out. Say it one more time. Hey, that worked out, right? And in fact, by the time we get to the middle of verse 35, the writer of Hebrews chapter 11 is getting so excited about these people who have been heroic for God and how these things have worked out. And he is listing off all of these great things that happen. And I want you to know something. As Devin was reading to you, these things that he read about, people escaping the fury of the flames, their weakness being turned to strength in battle, so that they routed foreign armies. He's not just writing some kind of hyperbole. He's not just creative, just thinking of what it might be if God's power was at work in their life. These are actual historic stories that he is remembering how God worked things out. I mean, all the way through the first half of verse 35 from Hebrews 11, at the end of every single story, Gideon and Barak and Jephthah and all of these people, we could say, hey, that worked out. And in fact, if he just ended Hebrews 11 in the middle of verse 35, we would leave so encouraged. We would just leave walking out here today going, man, isn't that cool? If you'll just live heroic life for God, he'll always make everything work out. But somehow, in the middle of verse 35, when the writer took just a moment to grab a breath, I don't know, maybe he set his quill down for a moment and grabbed a sip of water. And in that moment between the first half of verse 35 and the second half of verse 35, suddenly out of nowhere, the dark clouds roll in. And all of a sudden, he says this: there were others who were tortured and refused to be released so they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, chains, imprisonment. Look, put to death by stoning, sawed in two, killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. And all of a sudden we're like, hey, we don't get to do the cheer. Somehow we don't get to say that. From here to the end of the entire chapter, something has changed. And I want you to know something. Just as in the first 35 verses, the writer was thinking of very specific, real circumstances when he wrote this, from memory, writing of the things that historically happened to God's people, all those, hey, that worked out stories. So too, from verse 35 on, when the writer talks about being stoned and being sawed in two and being put to death by the sword and facing jeers and flogging and having to wander around destitute and all of those things, he has very specific people in mind as well. He knows that is part of the story. Listen, he knows that is part of the story of the people of God. That to really fully and honestly tell the story of what it means to be heroic, it will include those who have been martyrs for the faith. Martyr means a witness, even unto death. You see, understand this morning, all believers die in their faith. Some die for their faith. And as we wrap this series up, and we have been talking about God's righteous followers and his risky followers and his resilient followers, I want to talk about one more heroic type of follower of God, and it's this. God says we are heroic when we have a regardless faith. A regardless faith. What do you mean by regardless? A faith that says, God, I am going to follow you regardless of what happens to me. And when I say regardless, I mean more than just whether or not you answer that prayer. I mean more than just whether or not I get that job. I mean more than regardless whether or not this circumstance works out or that circumstance works out. I want to say to you today that the followers of God down through the ages have been able to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ all the way to us in this day and age, in this place, in this comfortable room today, because there have been followers of Jesus Christ who were heroic because they had a regardless faith that said, even if I must lay down my life for him, I will. Because everyone dies in their faith, but some even have to die for their faith. Come on, is there anybody here today who understands and is grateful and realizes we have the gospel today because some spilled their blood so that we would have it? So that the faith would remain true. Hear me. Every generation of the followers of God have had their martyrs. Every single expert agrees, 100% across the board, that in the 20th century, the 1900s, there were more martyrs for the Christian faith than the total of all of the 19 centuries added together, totaled up before it. Don't think today, as we take these closing minutes of this series, to talk about the kind of faith that is a regardless faith that says, God, I'll follow you no matter what happens in my life and no matter what you do. Don't think today that we're comparing ourselves to something that is just long gone in history. But to this very day, there have been men and women who were willing to lay their lives down. A level of commitment to keep the gospel alive. It was Tertullian, about AD 200. 200 years after the resurrection, who coined this phrase, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. You see, as the writer of Hebrews is penning these words, he knows that the faith he is enjoying at that moment has come to him because there were those who were faithful before him. Let me take a few minutes today and let me pull you back into history that we might start with an amazing appreciation for what it took for you and I today to be free to sit here and in freedom enjoy the gospel of Christ. Let me take you all the way back in history to a time where the Jewish people were under great suffering. You see, you need to understand that the book of Hebrews was written to Jewish people who had become believers in Jesus Christ, and now they were suffering great persecution. And so the writer is trying to encourage them as they're going through it. And so one of the things he does is as he writes Hebrews 11, he encourages them of the great victories that God has won. And he reminds them that others have gone before them and laid down their lives. One of the classic examples of this is during a time that falls during what we call an era of silence. There's about 400 years between the last prophecy in the Old Testament and the coming of Jesus in the New Testament, if you will, between Malachi and Matthew, all right? There's about 400 years in there. We call it the time of silence. During those years, as you may or may not know, the Greek nation ruled so much of the world, but during the end of the Greek reign, it was the Romans who came in and displaced the Greeks. And when the Romans began to displace the Greeks, the way the Romans would work is that when they took over a land, if they could set up inside of that land what was already an operating political methodology, they would allow those powers to stay in place. As long as they remained completely subservient to the Romans, they'd let them stay. By the way, that's why when you get into the Gospels and you learn that like Herod is ruling there over Jerusalem and over Judea, even though he's a local boy, it's because the Romans have set it up that way. That's what they did with some of the Greeks. Now, many of the Greeks were determined that the Greek way of living was the only way to live. And they were desirous to stomp out any thinking that would differ from them whatsoever. One of them was the last powerful ruler of the Greeks. He was a man called Antiochus Epiphanes. He chose the name Epiphanes for himself, which means God manifest. Had a relatively high opinion of himself, as you can see. It'd be like if you're like, you said, my middle name is God, And so Antiochus Epiphanes, after he's been captured by the Romans, but he's still ruling in his area, subservient to Rome, he decides that he's going to go down and flex his own muscles, and he's going to go down to Egypt, and he's going to subdue the Egyptians. And so he goes on his way, but the Romans learn of this, and they are very, very unhappy about it. And so the Romans dispatch a small group of soldiers along with an ambassador named Gaius. And Gaius goes and he cuts Antiochus Epiphanes off on the path. He catches him on the road on the way to Egypt. And Gaius says to Antiochus, whoa, where are you going? Antiochus says, I'm going to subdue Egypt. And Gaius says, well, Rome says we don't think that's a good idea. And so he says to Antiochus, we need to know your decision. What are you going to do? So Antiochus says to Gaius, I tell you what, I will go back and I'll consult with my leaders and I will give Rome an answer. In what now is a famous historic moment, Gaius takes a sword, draws a circle in the dirt around Antiochus and says, give me your answer before you step out of the circle, that I may take it back to the Roman Senate. Antiochus knows what he's saying. Antiochus knows he's saying if he goes on against Egypt, Rome will bring the full force of its power against him. And here's why I tell you this story. Antiochus goes back home with his tail between his legs, angry, humiliated in front of his soldiers, but on his way home, he goes past Jerusalem. And he vents the full fury of his bitterness and anger against Jerusalem and against God's people. He breaks into Jerusalem, subdues the people there, goes into the temple, and wreaks havoc on it. He steals all of the valuables from the temple. He sets up in the temple an altar to Zeus, to the Greek god Zeus. He sacrifices pig's flesh on the altar in Jerusalem, an absolute abomination to them. He sets up eventually a statue of himself inside of there. The Jews go into outrage over this profaning of the temple, and Antiochus responds by just slaying more and more and more of them. It's a bloodbath. He's killing them for their faith. He goes into the temple courts, And he sets up brothels, houses of prostitution in the temple courts. Systematically tortures and kills all the leaders of the God-fearing Jews in ways so horrible you hardly want to imagine them. He decrees to the Jews they no longer can circumcise their children when they are born, which is the physical symbol of their relationship with God. And then he begins to pull in the men and force them to eat pig's flesh. And if they will not, he kills them. One of those stories tells us that at the height of this persecution and martyrdom of those people of God, there arose a father of a family named Judas Maccabees who says enough is enough. And even though he knows it'll cost him his life, he raises up a band of those who begin to say, we've got to stand against this. We've got to defend and protect our faith before it is completely wiped out. Story after story after story tells you of the tragedy of those who laid down their lives to protect their faith. One of those stories tells of a man who fought against those Greeks, and when he was killed, they brought out his wife and his 6 sons. They came and stood them before a torture contraption that Antiochus had created. It was basically a human frying pan. And he brought out those 6 boys and their mother, and he made the mother stand there, and they came to the first son, and they said, renounce your God and eat pig's flesh. And he said, I will not renounce my God. And they cut off his hands, and they cut off his feet, and they threw him on top of the fire. And the mother watched as the second son came and stood in the same place where the first son had been. And they said, renounce your faith. And he said, I will not. And they cut off his hands and they cut off his feet and they threw him on top of the fire. And this mother watched as all 6 of her sons stood and said, I will not renounce Jehovah God. And they killed them all in terrible, brutal death. And when they all had died, they took a sword and ran the mother through and killed her as well. You see, when the writer says they were stoned and they were sawed in two and they were put to death by the sword, he's talking about very real people who died for their faith. 2 Timothy says, all who live godly lives will suffer persecution. This is the reality in our world, folks. This is the truth you must understand. All those who trust God and will live for him must be willing to say, God, I will be faithful, and I hope when I am, I get rescue. But if I don't, and I get martyrdom, that's your decision to make, not mine. Are you with me? Do you understand what I'm telling you? I'm telling you, we get the option to say yes or no to God, but it is God who chooses for our lives when it's all said or done. Option A, that you will die in your faith or that you will die for your faith. Only God gets to choose that for his followers. And these people are faithful unto death. Now, we love the stories when people escape the fury of the flames. Don't you love it when Pastor Todd preaches on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? We love it when those who are weak are made strong in battle, and we can celebrate Gideon taking on forces so much larger than his and winning the battle. We love that. But what in the world do we do when we get option B? And we must trust our sovereign God. Here's what I want you to know. In that moment, the stories of those nameless ones from the last few verses of Hebrews 11 are no less impressive to us than the stories of the ones with names who got the victory. Do you see that? The value to us today as the people of God is just as great for those who got God's option A as those who got God's option B. In fact, the writer, stopping to be overwhelmed by those who have given their lives so that he could know faith in Christ, says this, the world was not worthy of them. Say it with me. The world was not worthy of them. Come on, say it again. The world was not worthy of them. One more time. The world was not worthy of them. Our world is caught up by the winners, by those who have the great victory stories, and those stories are great, but I say to you, God takes note of things that we never know. God knows names of people we don't know names of. God sees things we have never seen, and our God doesn't miss it. No, he doesn't miss a beat. How do you know he pays attention, Pastor Todd? How do you know when someone ends up martyred for the faith? How do we know when some of those people in the Middle East give their lives? How do we know that God didn't somehow miss it, that he wasn't somehow distracted by something else? Does God really notice? Well, look at the very first Christian martyr, Stephen. Look at the end of his story from Acts 7. Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Folks, this story is happening as they're picking up the stones to end his life in a brutal, violent way. And Stephen said, "Look, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." Do you understand what I have just said to you? Do you know what Jesus' place and position is as he is today, waiting to come again for us? The Bible reveals what it is. He's at the right hand of God. But the Bible says to us very clearly in multiple places, he's not standing at the right hand of God. He is, anybody know what it is? Seated at the right hand of God. But in this moment of Stephen's death, of him giving his life for the gospel of Christ, the Bible says to us, in honor of what he's doing, in respect for what's going on, Jesus stands up, folks. He looks down and sees what's going in. And as Stephen looks up, he sees the Son of God himself saying, "Bravo, Stephen. You're hanging into the very end. You consider your life not above the price that you are willing to give." And the Father stands and he looks down upon that martyr. He says, "Stephen, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and it will be through men and women like you that the gospel will go all the way to Mechanicsville, Maryland." And our God doesn't miss it. Not once. And the writer gets to the end of this whole chapter with all these unnamed people who have held on to that regardless faith, serving God regardless of whether he gives me option A or option B. And here's how he finishes it up, because there's one more thing you got to see. It says this: "These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect." I've read that verse a lot of times. Thought, what exactly does that mean? Thought I knew, but there was something about the way that verse was built. I was like, there's something more than what I'm getting here. Here's what it is. It took a long time. You see that thing there that says, none of them received what had been promised? What had been promised is not rescue. In fact, to figure out what had been promised is, you have to go to those next important words. Since God had planned, what's the next two words? Something better. What is the something better? God had planned something better for us. What's the something better that we get? Well, at first I thought, well, obviously the something better is heaven. God planned something. It's heaven, right? It's got to be heaven. No. The something better is not heaven, because heaven is at the end of the passage. The last three words. What are the last three words? Be made perfect. What are they? Be made. How many think that's happening here on earth? Not raising my hand. Because I will never be perfect here on earth. I can have a perfect intention to follow God, but I'll never follow him in perfection. Excuse me. No, the be made perfect is not here on earth. So the something better is not be made perfect. Sweetheart, can I have that Wawa cup right there? Thank you. So the something better is not heaven. And we know the something better is not rescue because we all are not rescued. We said there's more martyrs. today than ever before. So the something better is not that we're rescued. So what is it? What is the something better? And all of a sudden it occurred to me. What was the promise they never saw? What was the promise they were living for? What was the something better they never got? Let me give you a hint. We're getting close to setting up trees. We're getting close to decking the halls. The something better is Jesus. The something better that they were promised, but they never received because their lives weren't lived at the time at which the promise was coming. The something better was Jesus. And the writer is saying this. All those people who carried that faith made it possible that the something better would come. What do you mean? I mean all those people, all those God-fearers who held true to the faith that they had, that God had promised something and it was coming. They made possible that one day there'd be a little girl at about 14, 15 years old, would have an angel come visit her and say, hey, blessed are you among women, Mary, because through you the Son of God is coming. And Jesus would be born and raised in a home where Joseph could tell him the stories of the faith. And you see, it was those martyrs that brought that faith around. And then the something better would show up. And then what this writer is saying is, oh, don't you see? Together with us. Together with us. And suddenly, he says this. The martyrdom isn't going to stop just because the something better has come. This is written. We know that Hebrews is written somewhere between AD 60 and AD 70. We know that because the book of Hebrews, it gives all these comparisons to the current temple system. The temple was destroyed in 70. Jesus dies about 33. So get this. This writer within one generation is writing this to persecuted Christians. They're being persecuted because there's a ruler right now over them named Nero. Ever hear that name? Causes Christians to shake in their boots. And this writer is not just remembering Jewish people who have died for their faith. He has contemporaries who are dying for it as well. And he says, God has planned something better. He says, you know what? Now when we die in our faith, we die with the knowledge of what Jesus has done for us. He gave his life for us. Every time one of us lays down our lives for him, every time one of us has a regardless faith, we do it with the knowledge of the something better that has been given for us. It's Jesus. And through the ages, people continue to give their all, given their life, so that you and I might know him. Is that the end, Pastor Todd? Is that what you want us to go home with today? Just a historic appreciation for what others did so that we'd have the gospel? Well, to be honest with you, that's only part. Because any of you who've been here long enough know full well we try to never have a sermon around here without some kind of so what that we take away for our own living. Someone nod their head that they know that. It'll make me feel better. We don't just come around here and have history lessons and go home. We don't just come here and have a bunch of rituals and go home. What's the gospel say for how I'm living my life today? That's what we're trying to do, and I've been trying to do that for 8 years. If you haven't gotten by now, I'm just not doing a very good job talking, or you're not doing a very good job listening. But what's the so what here? What really is the so what here, Pastor Todd? Because let's be really honest in this room. The percentage chance that right now you're going to go out this door and become a martyr for Jesus today is small. Come on. It's small. It's large in the Middle East. It's small here. So what do you get? Where do you go? Here's what I share for you to wrap us up on heroic faith. Our greatest risk right now in this nation is not martyrdom as Christians. It's comfort. It's that we are so comfortable and we have it so easy that we kid ourselves about what really are the great crosses that we bear. So much so that I think we fall to a faith that can't even grasp what a regardless faith is like. And I want to challenge you this morning. What would happen if a fire were burning inside of the people of God that said, you know what? We may not be facing martyrdom today, but I can tell you this. I've driven a stake deep that says in my life, I have a regardless faith so that whatever it is that comes my way, whatever might happen that God would ask of me, I would say yes to that. Whatever he would ask. I want that kind of passion and zeal because somebody was willing to die and some of them had to so that I could be a believer. And so I tell you what, there's nothing that'll get in the way. There's nothing that'll keep me from following him and serving him all the days of my life. Because I want to be honest, some of us, man, we got to work out our faith muscles because we're pretty wimpy. We are. Some of us want to come to say, man, Pastor Todd, you know, the other day I mentioned that I go to church and I heard a couple people laugh. I felt so persecuted. I want to say, really, get over yourself. Really? That was persecution for you? Did that really hurt? How long? Your little feelings got hurt? Is that what it was? Some of you are like, man, in youth group, they tell me when I go to school, I ought to pray over my meal just to be a witness right there. But man, no one else is praying over their meal. You really want me to take 15 seconds and thank God in the middle of my day? You know what kind of persecution that'll bring on me? Really? There's some teenagers in the Middle East who don't have a dad anymore because they cut his head off. It's persecution because you prayed over your lunch. I'm trying to be mean here today. I'm just trying to wake us up to the reality that once we're comfortable, faith can so easily just kind of dissipate to where we act as if it's a big deal for the pastor to say, you know what? Sometimes we need to just look at our calendar and say, man, I'm going to prioritize being in the house of God on a weekend. And if Pastor Todd says that, boy, he's really being bold and going after us today. Really? Someone today is making a decision about whether or not to be baptized, knowing that when they do, they'll become destitute because their whole village will shut them out. That someone may come burn their house down before the week is out. Some of them are deciding whether or not to show up at the house of worship because recently in their town, the last time people showed up at church, the outsiders came, locked the doors, and burned it down with all them inside. And that's why they're thinking about whether or not they're going to go to church. I remember being in a swimming pool one day and have a little girl say, I'm scared of you because you shout. You're always mad. I'm not angry this morning. I'm just longing to know what would happen if the people of God who call themselves real lifers began to say, you know what, I've got a regardless faith. And when my kids get mad because we're going to serve God around here, it's going to mean we act different, dress different, look different, do different things with our money, are unashamed of the gospel. We stand up for what's right. You know what? I don't care what anybody else thinks. And honey, I'm sorry that makes you feel a little bit of an outcast sometimes with some of your friendships. But I want you to know something right now. There's people who've paid a lot higher price than that. And Jesus is going to be worth it. And when it's all said and done, God's playing something better for us. And he died on a cross for us. And we can live for him. And all I want to do today is just challenge you to a regardless faith. To say, I've decided to follow Jesus, and there will be no turning back on this commitment. Ever happens to my life going forward. I'll tell you something, every nation has had its martyrs. And I don't doubt this nation's day is coming. You can take that for what it's worth. When it does, if it's in our age, I hope you will stand with me and we will say, we have a regardless faith. God, option A, I die in you. Option B, I die for you. Either way, I've decided to follow Jesus. I was 17 years old and I was at our teen camp, like we do here when we send kids off to our camp here, and I was at our camp. It was called Brookendale. They should have called it Camp Hole in the Wall because there was a hole in every wall. That camp, let me tell you, that was an old rundown camp. Food was terrible, but the presence of God was good. And always at camp, if you've done camp growing up, it goes to that last night. There's this big deal about the last night. Man, that's where you're hoping that the people who've held back from committing, they're going to make a commitment to Christ. And so I'm in this tabernacle, and the guy is speaking. Man, he's just doing a great job, and he is just really challenging us. Man, if you're going to live for God, you got to go deep for God. If you're going to live for God, you got to go deep for God. So he gets to the end, and he says, we're going to sing the song, I Have Decided to Follow Jesus. And here's what he said. He said, I'm going to start singing. He said, and if you've really decided to follow Jesus, and you mean no turning back, no matter what, then I want you to stand up and start singing along. He said, I don't care if we sing it once or twice or 5 or 10 times. I don't care how long it takes, but after you've done business with God, then you stand up and you sing along. And I took to heart what he was saying. I was serious about what he was saying. I'm sure everybody else was too. And so they started to sing. And I got my head in my hands. Because I'm really thinking, God, really? Man, I'm 17. I don't even know all that means. I don't even know what you'll call me. I don't know what I'll go through tomorrow. No, yes, unless 20 years from now. Am I really going to follow you no matter what happens? And I'm wrestling with this. Because by now you know me. If I'm nothing else, I am honest and open. And you know what it's like when your head's bowed, but you can sense people are starting to stand up. And I can sense some of my buddies next to me are standing up. I can tell there's people starting to stand up all over the place. And then you kind of hit what I call just kind of the critical mass, where a bunch of people have stood up, and all the other ones, and I'm by no means condemning intentions, but it just kind of happens in a group. I could just kind of sense it was the moment when everybody kind of, well, I guess standing up is the thing to do. And everybody stands up. And here they're singing and they're belting it out and they're celebrating. I've decided to follow Jesus. And in that room, probably 170 teenagers, everyone standing except one. God, am I sure? Will I really? And they sang it a few more times. When they prayed, so everybody's head was bowed, I just slipped out and I went back to my room. I sat down on my bed, had my Bible in my hands. I thought, God, could I really live a Hebrews 11 faith? All the way even to death if you chose option B for me? Could I really? I mean, they had long since closed out there. They were into the next thing. They were showing a movie or something. I sat for what felt like hours in my cabin. Finally, I settled it with God. And I stood up all alone in that cabin where no one could hear me sing but God. And I sang, I've decided to follow Jesus, no turning back. It was 32 years ago. I'm more sold on it today than I was then. It's my heart's longing. And this morning, would you be heroic enough to have a regardless faith? It says, God, regardless, however it all ends for me, God, I'd follow you to the very end, no matter what you ask. In a moment, we're going to bow our heads. I'm going to pray a really brief prayer, and then our team's going to start singing. When they do, if this morning that's you, if you've already made that commitment, or if you're making that commitment this morning, what I'm asking you to do is when they start to sing, when you're ready, doesn't have to be the first note, doesn't have to be the first chorus, but when you're ready, if you mean it, you can stand. Now, I want to tell you something. In a room with 170 people, Todd Crofford sat while everybody else stood. And there will be no judgment on any person in this room today for standing or for sitting. Because this is an honest moment between you and God. I'm not trying to talk anybody into anything, and there's no pressure on you. And if you don't stand up in the next 5 minutes, you are just as well welcome back in this room next weekend with no one thinking any differently of you than as if you had stood. And you need to know that. Don't you walk out of this place and say, I wasn't ready for that commitment yet, and so now I'm embarrassed and I'm not coming back. There is no judgment in this room today. This is just between us and God. But if this is your moment and you're ready for this, we need to declare together, I've decided, Lord, in this moment,